Hello traders, and today we are going to be talking about fractals on this YouTube Live. Fractals themselves are not the most long-winded explanation needed indicator-wise, so I figured we'd also sort of pull in apiary pivots, which are pretty similar to what the fractals do in a way. A little different, some similarities there, so we'll sort of look at both of those right there. First off, before we sort of get started, we'll just go into a little bit of background about what fractals are. Aside from an image, if you were to zoom in and zoom in and zoom in, that same image would keep recurring, a very recursive image. Fractals, when it comes to trading, are a Bill Williams indicator, one of the infamous names which we seem to come across a lot when we're talking about indicators. And Bill Williams had developed these fractals, and what they are in terms of trading is it's a succession of 5 candles where that third candle or the middle candle reaches a highest high or a lowest low out of that 5 candle span. And so Bill Williams, this is one of the sort of indicators which he used to show highs and lows, and we've previously talked about the Alligator Indicator. And fractals were used by Bill Williams in conglomeration with the Alligator indicators to sort of give you those entry points and continuations of trends, and the Alligator just confirmed what had happened with the fractals. And when we talked about the Alligator previously, we have our lips, our teeth, and our jaws, and as all of those moving averages sort of start to close in on each other, we sort of talked about it as the Alligator eating the market or chewing up the market price sort of as it goes into those consolidations or where it goes into those ranges where it's not sure which direction it wants to break. That same concept will be used. However, instead of the Alligator sort of chewing the markets, it'll be closing in and starting to quote-unquote bite down on the fractals, and that'll sort of be where we'd be exiting these fractal trades. And so just a little background there. Bill Williams used them to sort of show highs and lows in the markets. But if we go ahead and we pull these up on Alveo, let me just switch over to Alveo real fast and we'll add the fractals on. So looking at fractals, if we look at the settings within Alveo, there's nothing there because the fractals, it's a set definition of those 5 candles. And so if we zoom in on the market price in here, what we can see is, so here we have that fractal down and fractal up are what they're referred to as. Fractals down are just on that bearish side, fractal up is just on that bullish side. And so if we go look anywhere where we have these fractals, we go 2 candles to the right, we can see that we haven't formed a higher high. 2 candles to the left, that's the highest high right there. Fractal low or fractal down, we have this is the lowest low on both sides, on either side of the price there. If we go on and sort of like I said, we'd be looking at the apiary pivots as well because they're somewhat similar in their design. Now if we go look, we can see right here we had fractals on both of these 2 candles and they are now covered up by the pivots. So let's go ahead, we'll make our fractals actually quite a bit larger so we'll be able to see those behind the pivots. So a little difficult to see, but we can see that here we have the arrow on top of the diamond, arrow on top of the diamond, we have our arrows. So everywhere there's a pivot, with the exception of right here and some other pivots as well, we do have those. Actually, oh, there is one there, I apologize, it's just hard to see because it's the red on red. So each one of the apiary pivots has a fractal on it. There are just, however, fractals that do not have the pivots. Part of the reason is we'll look a little bit at the calculation for the apiary pivots right now. Apiary pivots are calculated in 2 ways. You have your horizontal variation and your vertical variation. Horizontal variation is how many candles do we want going the opposite direction from the current candle or the previous candle, I suppose, this many candles previous. How many candles going the opposite direction until we form a pivot. So by default, apiary pivots have that horizontal variation of 3. That horizontal variation means we need 3 candles going in the opposite direction. Once we get that 3rd candle, we'll put that pivot on that 4th candle back, that bullish candle, let's say, which had those 3 bearish candles following it. Easiest way to figure out the pivots is that one right there. You can look at a chart, you can say, we'd be able to look right here and say, okay, here, and let's move this aside just a little bit, and we'll talk about why there's not a pivot here, even though it does meet the criteria. So there's a pivot, there should be a pivot low right here because we have 1, 2, 3, 5 candles going in the opposite direction of this candle. So in theory, we should have the pivot there. However, we do not, because there's 2 types of pivots. Let's decrease the settings menu a little bit. You have your pivot, pivot high, pivot low. Then you have major pivots, your major pivot high, major pivot low. And so what the difference between these major pivots and then these just normal pivots is the second calculation, the vertical variation of the pivots. And so vertical variations, long formula, sort of a proprietary Apiary Fund formula, which off the top of my head I would not be able to recite to you. However, I do know that it has to do with the previous highs, previous lows, current highs, current lows, and the current shift in the current price versus the previous open to close price. It takes a lot of numbers in. Thankfully, we don't need to calculate that one. Like I said, that one I don't even know off the top of my head. While I do know a lot of indicator calculations, this one is not one of them. However, vertical variation, if all those numbers for the candles are put into the calculation, spits out the number. If that number equals 0.08 or greater, then it will go ahead and put that pivot in. If that calculation exceeds that 0.08 by certain criteria that are set up in that formula, once again, I don't recall the exact specifications. I think it's 1.5 to 2 times, a little iffy on that number, but I believe it's 1.5 times this value right here, so 0.14. If it equals 0.14 or greater, it puts in that major pivot. And so with the pivots, unlike the fractals, is after every pivot low, you have to have a pivot high. After every pivot high, you have to have a pivot low. You can have 2 fractal downs or 2 fractal ups in a row. You can't have 2 pivot highs or 2 pivot lows in a row though. And that's where that differentiation comes in. And that's why you'll see a lot of times certain fractals that don't have pivots and vice versa. And so the reason why we don't have one on, say, this candle is because we had a previous pivot right here, which was of greater value than this pivot here. Excuse me, my throat. Greater value than this pivot here. And so it kept this one off here and kept this one on. Since we don't end the pivot high right here, the next pivot high, this one here, would have formed a higher pivot equation wise, and so we don't have that one in there. And so that's one of the things, if you are using the apiary pivots, is they are constantly they can constantly change. You can have a pivot high, you can have a pivot low, and then a few candles later you may have a stronger directional change. It'll take that previous pivot off and put on a new pivot on the specific candle. And so those are the main differences between the fractals and the pivots, is just in that way that they're calculated. You can have multiple fractal downs, multiple fractal ups in a row. You cannot have multiple pivot highs or multiple pivot lows in a row. And if we go ahead, we'll go ahead and cancel out of this menu here. So we can see though that every pivot has a fractal on it for the most part. Won't always be the case. Right here, I believe, yeah, I had to get a little closer right here. We don't have that fractal down. Well, actually, we should. It's just behind that candle once again. A little hard to see. Oh yeah, we do. Okay, see, fractal, fractal, fractal. Not all of them though, because not every pivot low will be the lowest low over the previous 2 candles. Most of the time it will, because of that reversal strength. It'll be a stronger reversal to form that fractal low or that fractal high, or to form that pivot low, pivot high, and that strength there will make it so that the next bearish movement, that next bearish wick or bullish wick, does not form the fractal, because odds are that pivot one is the highest of highs. We'll go one more thing about the pivots real fast before we sort of go back to the fractals and see if you guys have it. And anytime you guys have questions, please feel free to put them in that comment section. I have my phone here with the comments so that I can read them while going over all of this. So if you do have questions on any of these, please feel free to type them out. But going back to the pivots, the main benefit that we use the pivots for, which we can't use the fractals for, and the reason that those sort of pivots were created, even though they're similar to the Bill Williams fractals, which we're using here, is the price and time cycles, which that's sort of a separate video topic, because that is its own subject in its own. Fractals, pivots, close enough together that we can talk about them at the same time. Price time cycles, that's a different topic for a different day. Next time we have a YouTube live by myself, that's possibly what I'll go over there, unless you guys have any recommendations. If you do, put those in the video comments, because that's how we decide what videos to do next. But price time cycles uses the pivots, measures from pivot high to pivot low, pivot high or pivot low, pivot high, pivot low, figures out how many pips and how many candles are between those different pivots to give you an average. Really useful in finding out your take profits and your stop losses, things of that nature there. And so that's where those pivots really come into use with the price and time cycles on Alveo. Sorry about that delay there. Let's go ahead, we'll take these pivots off. Makes it a little hard to see some of the fractals. And what we'll do is we will go and use these fractals as Bill Williams had intended. Let's go ahead, put the Alligator Indicator on. We'll leave that with the defaults that were set up here. And we'll go ahead and look at some of the entries, exits for these fractals. And so with the fractals, what we're really looking for is we want to enter these buys as we're getting these fractal downs, and enter some sells as we're getting these fractal ups. As we're getting these fractal ups and downs, that's letting us know that we have formed that highest high, and we're getting that sort of momentum going in the opposite direction. So when we see that fractal high form, or that fractal up, I keep saying high, I apologize, that fractal up form, such as right here. There we go, mouse wasn't working for a second. Fractal up form in here. It's going to be delayed. It's not going to appear until this third candle right here, where we have that, it's a bullish candle. However, it's still letting us know that we have that bearish momentum, because this is the highest high that is formed. So we went up, we peaked, and we're starting to go in that bearish direction. And so once this really sort of forms is our sell. And so what we're really looking for with the Alligator is, well, whichever happens first. If we get that fractal low first, fractal down first, we'll want to be closing out of that sell, because that is letting us know that we've reached that sort of that trough, and we're starting to get that reversal, which we see here, fractal high form, so we could enter that sell again. But what we'd be looking for on the buy side is, so here we have our fractal down, and so we have 1, 2 candles. So that fractal down happens right on this candle here that the crosshair's at. Once it closed out, it knew that we weren't going to go any lower, so we formed that down. And what we really want to look for is when we start to get that crossover with the lips and the teeth and the jaws, that one's in that chewing on the market, that biting on the market. And that's sort of letting us know that we're finishing up that fractal, we're biting down, and soon we're going to be forming a new fractal. And so we really get the first crossover with the lips going above the teeth right here on this candle, as we can see. So the candle right before we form that fractal. And so that's our exit candle right here when we start to get this crossover occur. So that happens about, let's say, halfway on the candle. This candle here was the one that let us in. So about 3 pips, 3 minutes. We're on a minute chart, so nothing too drastic. But let's bump up our time frame here actually and see if we can find a little bit more exciting of an entry here with the fractals. There we go. And so fractal exits, when we start to get the alligator mouth biting down, we get that chewing on the market, or we get the next fractal, whichever one happens first. And once again, the sort of downfall with these fractals is the fact that it's a very delayed indicator. You don't get that fractal until 2 candles after the fractal candle, or whichever candle the fractal is on, which really does make them a very delayed indicator. It's not at all leading. The alligator is more so when you'll be doing the exits a lot of the time. And so here we have our buy candle right here. So our buy happens right on this one as we start to gain that momentum. As we can see, the alligator is still sort of in its sell position. If you know, we recall the alligator, the exit happens as we start to get that biting down, which is right here. And so right here we get the order, or right on this candle here, we get that order for the buy. It's letting us know that this is sort of where our buy starts alligator-wise, because our lips are above our teeth, are above our jaw. And so that happens on this candle here. So the fractals in this case get us in a little earlier, lets us know that we've reached that trough. We're starting to go in that bullish direction, so we'll go ahead, enter there, and then we form that fractal. Fractal forms right here. So that's our duration right here. That's 63 pips, 9 candles, 18 hours, since we're on a 2-hour chart. So 63 pip gain right there, since that fractal forms there. We can't exit as much as we wish we could. Can't exit on that peak right there, because that high, or that fractal, doesn't appear until this bearish candle has concluded its course, and it's here, and we know that we're not going to form that higher high. We form, once again, we get that fractal low, happens on this candle. We go ahead, we enter the trade, we close out, and this one was a loss, because those fractals are that delayed indicator. We get this fractal low, let's say 1, 2, fractal low forms here, enter that, we get that high 2 candles later, after we've already, we're down 43 pips. We don't have that chewing on the market, we don't have those crossovers. That fractal high form, or the fractal up, formed after this big bearish downfall. And so, since in both cases, in the terms of the alligator, we're using that shifted moving average, so they are all shifted over to the right a little bit, and so we get those delayed sort of falls and everything in the price action. And the fractals, by definition, have to wait 2 candles before it forms. The stop losses become very important when you're using these fractals. The previous fractals are a good place to put those stop losses. And so, where do we go? So here we have that buy right here. Buy goes, we're going up, and oops, I right clicked there. So buy, we're going up, we went up about 30 pips there, but we want to start watching where that fractal went, and also where we start to, where my cursor disappeared there for a second. Fractal goes here, there we go. Where we start to see that we may possibly be forming that fractal. Since they are exceptionally delayed, a lot of times you can catch where those fractals will form before they even do. And once again, if we put in those apiary pivots, once again, very similar to fractals, the candles where they are, there we go, we get that pivot high formed right there. And since that pivot high, it's a major pivot, we know that it didn't use the horizontal variation. We know that it used vertical variation because it is a pivot high. And so fractal happens right here. We enter that buy, and that pivot forms on the price close. It forms right here for that total value of the 20 pips right there. We know that formed there because it looks at the highs versus the close of the candle. And so on the close, before this candle even started going bearish, this pivot high had formed. And so that's another reason, aside from the fact that the fractals and pivots do come commonly on same candles. One of the reasons I wanted to go over the pivots is that those pivots, they will form before the fractals do a lot of the time, unless we're relying on a horizontal variation. If we're relying on a horizontal variation, that fractal will form the candle before, because we need 2 candles after that fractal up or fractal down forms to put the fractal there. It's a lot of fractal. And if we're using horizontal variation, we need 3 candles going the opposite direction. But for those fractals to form, a lot of times that the pivots will be formed off of the vertical variation rather than the horizontal variation. So they'll appear on the candle that the fractal will 2 candles before that fractal appears. And so using Alveo, if you're using other trading software, you of course don't have access to the apiary pivots, but on Alveo, if you are using the Alveo software, you do have that option to have those pivots on there. And if you are using the fractals, even if you are using the alligators as well, once again, if we look, this was our buy happens here. We didn't start closing on the market until this value right here, for a total of 25 pips down. And then if we look at the fractal forming, it was 44 pips down, very close in the way in which and how much we're losing there. But if we have that pivot there, we're closing out earlier because that pivot's forming before the fractal. And so while Bill Williams said alligators and fractals are the two you use together, alligators and fractals, great combination. Bill Williams was, good man, good trading. I mean, his name's thrown around a lot. He created countless indicators that we use in our day-to-day trading. But having something else on there, such as those apiary pivots, I mean, the fractals were made in I want to say the 80s. If I have my dates right, I want to say the 80s. I might be wrong. If someone knows better, please correct me in the comments there. But I believe the fractals were the 80s. A lot of progress has been done since then. A lot of new indicators formed. So not just going strictly what they say, won't hurt. Those pivots, they will be beneficial there as well. And so Lance had asked that the apiary pivot's delayed by 2 candles as well. And so going back to the pivot calculation, that really depends on which one we're using. If we are using the horizontal variation, it is delayed by 3 candles, so we need 3 candles going the opposite direction. It doesn't matter highs and lows, it just looks at if it's a bullish or bearish candle. And so that's where there may be slight discrepancies between fractals and pivots, is if we have a major wick going on one of our bearish candles, but it's a major bullish wick on a bearish candle, that fractal may form, but that pivot won't on the horizontal variation because it's not 3 candles going the opposite direction. Now you can change that horizontal variation to 2. By changing that horizontal variation to 2, you are making it so it is using the same same calculation as the fractals. Once again, it's not concerned with highs and lows, but it is concerned with type of candle, bullish or bearish. So changing that to 2 will give you a closer index to the fractals, but typically I leave that one at 3 most of the time, or 2 to 3, because you have the 3-bar reversals and things like that. But vertical variation is going to be the one that happens first. Vertical variation will happen on the set candle. This pivot here was formed vertical variation. This pivot was formed vertical variation. This pivot was formed vertical variation. All of these were formed vertical variations, which means that they were formed on this candle on the close of the price. So we saw that price shoot up. We saw that price shoot down. We saw the close happen here. On the close, that candle calculated the highs, lows, open and close of the candle along with previous highs and closed, and knew that that pivot was going to be there. And so while that pivot's there right now, that fractal formed on this candle here, this bearish candle, while that pivot formed on the exact candle that it's on because it used that vertical variation in its calculation. So it really depends on what numbers you have set if it's going to be delayed. The larger you make that vertical variation, the more likely you are to trigger that horizontal variation, but the stronger reversals are going to trigger that horizontal and put those pivots on there at once. So it really just sort of depends on which one you want to rely on more. If you don't really care about candles going in the opposite direction, if you don't really care about bearish candles following bullish or bullish following bearish, you can set that horizontal variation to 10, 20, anything like that, sort of an outrageous number, if you will. where you're not going to have that many candles in a row, on any normal circumstance. And then any pivot you see will only be the vertical variation. If you really only want to see those pivots formed like those pseudo fractals, then you would go ahead and you would just set that vertical variation to 2 or 3. The higher you set that number, the stronger the reversal has to be for that pivot to form. Lower you set the number, the weaker the reversal has to be to go in that specific direction. So why change the pivot variation to 12 as one instructor had us do? So changing that pivot variation to like the 12, they're probably, I would hope they were talking about that horizontal variation, changing that to 12. And what that really does is that just makes sure that you're not getting any horizontal variation pivots in there. It's just really making sure that the only pivots you see are ones that are based off of price reversals. And so the larger you set this number for the horizontal variation, that horizontal variation is, I have a bullish candle, how many bearish candles do I need in a row after that bullish to form that pivot? So by setting that horizontal variation to 12, you're pretty much filtering out any price change in direction, and you're strictly relying on reversals. We're only looking for where price changes by a certain amount. And so that's why the instructor you could choose 12, you could choose 30. They'd have virtually the same effect, because what are the odds that you have 12 candles in the same direction? Odds of that are so minuscule. You can set it to 30, you can set it to 50, you can set it to 5,000. Really, by changing it to 12, that instructor really just said, we're only concerned with the vertical variation, we're only concerned with those price pivots, and not so much directional changes in the price. So that's pretty much it for the fractals and the pivots in my book. Like I said, the fractals, they're pretty straightforward. And the reason, I feel like I probably didn't say this, and I probably should. The reason those fractals are like that, we have the lowest low, and then we're going up, is if we were to, in theory, shift to a smaller time frame, that lowest low would still be, it would be the lowest low on the previous time frame, and we should still have that sort of V shape, or upside down V or V shape in the market. And so we're sort of fractalizing the time frames in theory. So as we go down in smaller time frames, we're still going to have that lowest low forming. And so we should still see that V or upside down V pattern as we shift into those smaller time frames, creating that fractal effect. And so that's what that one is. So any final questions before we sort of finish up our live for today? See, and there's a slight delay, so if I'm paused, it's just because I'm waiting for the catch up with you guys and see your questions that you have typed. I'm not seeing anything pop up. I think I've waited for enough of YouTube for their delay to go ahead and catch up. So thank you guys for coming to live today. Like and subscribe to the video. That way you'll get notifications when we go live. We do occasionally, not too often, but occasionally go live aside from the Wednesdays, things like that. Sean's on the cruise right now, so who knows if he'll do anything. A little difficult to get in contact with him while he's out on the ocean, but he'll possibly do something. I don't know. But if you subscribe, you'll get the notifications anytime we get live, anytime we publish new videos like this. And also, once again, put in the comments sort of what indicators or strategies you'd like to see discussed in these Wednesday lives, or other videos which we publish in general. Fractals, that was one of the requested videos, so we do look at those comments. We do take what you guys request, so put in the comments what videos you guys would like. Thank you for coming to this Wednesday live, and happy trading, and see you all next week.